biopharma and medical device sectors, the similarities are very obvious ones. Both of them are trying to get a product in market, and they're trying to show how safe and efficacious the drug or the medical device or diagnostics is before it reaches a patient. So they're both trying to do the same thing, trying to solve a similar problem. So a drug is trying to solve a problem for some of the disease or intervention, same thing as the medical device. So these are some of the similarities. But where they are very different is the way the clinical trial is conducted, starting from the design of clinical trial. Even if you see the length of the trials, the length of a biopharmaceutical trial would be way longer and would have way more patients than the one in a medical device trial. And you can imagine that in a pharmaceutical drug, you can have placebo, but it's very hard to have them in medical device. You can imagine if somebody has an implant, you can't have somebody not have an implant and walk around. So you have to use certain other techniques, such as synthetic data, simulated data, to make a comparison between the two, where it's way easier in a biopharmaceutical world versus medical device. So there are similarities, but then there are a lot of places where they are completely dissimilar. And there's another big one, that is in medical device, if you have a pre-market approval, you can go to the market really fast as opposed to biopharmaceutical, and you may not need a big, large clinical trial, which are known as pivotal trials, which would be absolutely necessary for a biopharmaceutical kind of a product.
In the end, a med device can just be something that a physician can decide what to do with. It is for the manufacturer to claim whether they want to do more with it, have clinical utility baked onto that. But you and I would agree that if a physician, a surgeon, is suturing something and is buying a specialized needle from Terumo, a medical device company, it would be foolish to say to Terumo, show us a biological clinical study which shows how the suturing is. So essentially those kinds of devices are built, and as long as they are not introducing a hazard, they don't have an E. coli infection attached to it or something like that, so there's a safety requirement. It's really the surgeon and the hospital staff who decide what to do with this, right? So their agencies like the FDA have said, we'll actually give you a classification system, class 1, class 2, class 3, SEMA alluded to PMA, the pre-market authorization, which requires a certain amount more clinical evidence than if you just categorize something, self-categorize it in the case of the US FDA as class 1. Generally regarded as safe, it's unlikely that the needle is going to cause a problem. We are self-declaring it. The agency has a right to come back and say, no, hang on, this is slightly more serious than just, but the initial part lets you get to market that much faster. So the release of the product, the intended use, the regulatory standards, the design and execution of clinical studies, which can change based on how you intend to market your product. And so in the 60s and 70s, we began to see in the drug world, the acceptance that a product may not cause a problem, a safety-related issue, create such potential risk that in fact indexing with regulatory agencies, especially with drugs, has gotten to an extreme of safety and efficacy. And that then goes over into how you market it, what statements you're allowed to make. Good news is, the regulators are getting more sophisticated about where to draw the lines. And on the device side, they're beginning to bring some of the best learnings from there onto the device side.
Biopharma has so many things that the medical device can learn from, and this is not just about conduct of clinical trial, right from getting into how do you design that clinical trial, where you make it flexible enough to make changes as you go along and not have a very rigid clinical trial. So you can have adaptive clinical trial. You can have clinical trials wherein a single medical device is being tested in different patient population. You can have multiple devices being checked at the same time in different patient populations. So how are you selecting that design so that you can get the best results out of it? The other thing that they can do is the use of biomarkers that are being used in biopharmaceutical clinical trials to actually find the disease progression and the overall health condition of the person, because if a person is falling ill, it may not always be that the device is failing or the intervention is failing. It could be because of some other reason which can be aptly pointed out using a biomarker. You can get right up to the proteomics level to see which protein spike is actually causing this. So having all this data can make your case even more stronger that, hey, yes, there was a problem, but this problem has been identified, and also you can augment this with real world evidence. The real world evidence is where you gather information from so insurance, from electronic medical records, health records, and say, okay, previous devices, same interventions, and this was what we found. So all these things can be added on to a clinical trial in medical device, and you can fortify the kind of findings you have and the evidence generation which is being asked by not just FDA but more in Europe about how do you follow through the medical device and get this evidence across the manufacturing, clinical, the entire process. So when you start off with all these things in mind and put all the key elements required that can actually show how safe your product is, how good the performance is, and then you put it out there, so not only you overcome the hurdle of regulatory, but also ensure that you get a very safe product to your patient and you reduce the chances or recalls or complaints, or you just try to minimize them.
Historically, device clinical trials were observational in nature versus interventional. They were registry-based, long tails to gathering data for the analysis. It was with the more recent advent, carefully designed clinical utility constructs, that the need for not just the data on is my product safe and efficacious, but for all of the operational levers of control to show the veracity of the data in that clinical study. That has gone up significantly and is now matching what has historically been something that biopharma and drug development has had to live with for a long time. If I'm going to have a way of doing a study setup, translate the clinical trial protocol into a multi-center coordinated approach where all of the physician training logs, the various healthcare practitioners who are involved in this, including the CR, the clinical research associates and clinical research monitors, having all of the paperwork, all the emails, all the qualifications back and forth, the questions that are asked, including what can sometimes be seen as small deviations from protocol that are allowed, right? Because the protocol might say something like, patient comes in and within 5 to 10 minutes, make your injection. Well, in some cases, the doc can do it in 5 minutes, sometime at the other extreme in 8 minutes. You need to record all of that. And all of that is a setup and collection of data to adhere to ultimately a quality standard for the data so that you can figure out when you're doing the analysis whether the effect you saw was really because of the device in this case, drug in other cases, or not. That entire industry of platform technologies has essentially begun to port over from pharma to devices. And so we're seeing a proliferation of that. And that's just part of it. The other part that we're seeing is about 10 odd years back, digital devices began to be built as essentially endpoints for pharma studies. Today, if you talk to a lot of the device and diagnostics companies in the digital space, they'll say, we build devices and software as a device, that has its own benefit in and of itself, whether or not it is connected to a drug. So they have begun to have platforms, like the Philips platform, the Philips HSP platform, that is unique just to the device space and can also be used in biopharma. I love the way it's changing.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's things like how do cloud-based technologies work, and that's also to be bread and butter, right? That wave towards mobilization of data so we can access it from anywhere, that's not biopharma or device, it's all across the board.
Yeah. So there are different technologies that can be used in the medical device industry that it's picked up from biopharmaceutical, and the biggest one that comes to my mind is the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. Why artificial intelligence? But everybody is going gung-ho over ChatGPT, so I don't think I have to introduce that topic. So medical device has been generating so much data. You can imagine, like we just mentioned the watch, you're getting your heart rate, you're getting your oxygen monitored, all this humongous terabytes of data, gigabytes of data. What do you do with that? How do you analyze it and say, what is the trend that's coming out of it? So these trends can be picked up right from, and I did mention about real world evidence being incorporated in clinical trials. Well, AI ML is perfect in picking up the insights from this real world evidence. As you can imagine, you're going to pick up information of millions of patients, find out their trend, and include that into your med device clinical trial to say, well, this was the findings in given this medical device on an intervention, and how it was safe over a period of a number of years. And we are doing something similar, so it just adds on to that. But having so much data, the best way to actually get the insight, and yes, like Avi mentioned, cloud. Well, you have humongous data. Where do you store it? Of course, in the cloud, right? So these cloud technologies, AI, ML, these are the top of the things that are being used, and I think 22% of the technology used is AI, ML within the technology space, and that's what I read. That's recent.
Because of the various forms of digital and patient safety related data standards that are emerging across borders, what at one time it seemed like a reasonably straightforward answer, have all of your data in some form of a cloud, whether it is on-prem, whether it is truly off-prem and out in some server farm. As it began to cross borders, it began to raise problems in terms of compliance. And we're now beginning to see a little bit of a change in the way that the data are stored. Mm-hmm. Not what you end up doing with them, but the co-mingling of data across borders has been essentially stopped the last several months as pharma companies and medtech companies start to say, well, will we be in violation in effect with a standard that while we are really not affecting patient health, we could be accused of violating this.
Yes.
Not worth it, right? Because the stringency of the standard, the penalties are so high. And the reason I brought this up is it's really an exciting time in our industry to figure out where all of these components, a drug which is interventional in nature, a device that could be a utility tool, all the way from that to actually being a critical part of an interventional surgery example, through to a social determinant of health, a data point that you're sort of going, well, is it useful? Let the consumer, not even necessarily the patient, decide. You're putting all of that together in a nice converged solution, which we don't have today. But it's exciting that we can now look at that and sort of say, ultimately we'll be able to put all of these together and let genuine consumerization take place as we figure out what the answers are.